The speculation surrounding the federal election date may be coming to an end after the RBA lowered the cash rate from 4.35% to 4.1%, a move that political strategists believe will help the government claw back support. It's now increasingly likely that Anthony Albanese will call the federal election off the back of the state election in WA. Labor MPs have reportedly been told that the election will be called anytime between March 3 and March 11, with the election date most likely to be April 12. Joining me now for more on this is News Corp's senior writer Patrick Carlyon. Patrick, let's start with the interest rate cut. First rate cut since November 2020. It's good news. I know the Labor backbenchers were pushing for a 50-point cut, but we'll take what we can get.
Oh, look, absolutely. It's the first one, since 2020. It's such a long time. People have suffered all the way through, all the way through COVID and all the rest. So it's very welcome. What struck me about this process, though, and you alluded to it, was the Labor backbenchers in this collective political campaign on the RBA to actually drop the rates. And it was very intense. And if you look at that election timeline that you just spoke of, perhaps April 5 or April 12, there's another RBA meeting, I think, on April 1. What's going to happen there? Are they going to be, out and out shouting and demanding another rate cut because it helps their electoral chances? It really was very, very disappointing to see, I thought.
And it was intense, and these calls for the RBA board to go out and actually see what's happening and get away from their computer screens and just looking at a single figure, the inflation rate. I do understand it because I think you do have to look beyond that. So much of the inflation we're seeing, Patrick, is because of the mad government spending. So they're causing the inflation,
yes,
and then they're telling the RBA, don't let that influence your decision about rates.
Yeah, and look, it's an economic decision, and it's done by very bright people who, yes, and that was a terrible sort of put down, wasn't it? You should be out on the streets talking to working class people. Well, they are experts who know what they're doing economically, and to sort of make it a political, or to try and shape it as a political decision, really is no good on so many levels. At a simple democratic level, why are politicians getting involved? It's dreadful.
Well, I'm not convinced that the RBA is all-knowing either, but we'll debate that another time. Let's talk about Landowner, WA landowner Tony Maddox. We've spoken to him on Outsiders a couple of times. He's now been found guilty of breaching WA's Aboriginal heritage laws after he built a bridge over an offshoot of the Avon River on his own property, on his own land, replacing an old bridge that had fallen apart. Maddox was charged last year because the creek beneath his bridge is associated with the rainbow serpent. That's a part of the dream time. We're not talking about an actual animal here. He's now been fined $2,000, given a conviction, and has to also pay $5,000 in costs. Patrick, to me, this is... You've got to be careful what you say, because you can't even give an honest opinion here without people losing their minds. But it seems astonishing to me, people who are happy to mock Christianity, happy to mock every major religion, they treat this as if it's almost beyond any criticism.
Well, it's sacred, isn't it? I mean, no one's ever heard of it before. And this poor bloke, Tony Maddox, I mean, he's doing work on his own property to make it easier for him. You're talking about these imaginary sort of stories that have nothing to do with the ebb and flow of the creek itself. And now he's out $7,000 fighting.
And the stress having this over you, having these sort of... We spoke to him last year, and I really do feel for people who get caught up in these sort of cases, because having the cost, the stress of a legal case like this, and he's now lost. So he's now got to consider, do I spend more money? Do I appeal it? And what are the risks of that?
He said he'd never heard of it when he did make the changes. And you believe him. He's working on his own property, and you would just assume.
And he had Indigenous people backing him, people from the local community. Yeah. Let's look at some alarming stats from the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, showing that students' knowledge of how Australian democracy works has plummeted to a new low. Just 28% of Year 10 students met the standard for civics and citizenship. That's disturbingly low, Patrick. 1 in 4 isn't really good enough given the amount of money we're spending in this sector. We seem to increase the spending in education and the standards go the other way.
Look, we are one of the best democracies in the world. It's better than America, I would argue. It's better than Europe, and certainly better than any country in the Middle East apart from Israel. These kids should learn how it works and why it is so good and why it is so important. And the fact that they're not sort of learning it, I think it sort of goes to the loss of the Australian identity that we're seeing in so many ways in the last couple of years. Australia, it's not a patriotic thing, but it's we need to understand why we are lucky and why we do it so well compared to the rest of the world.
I can understand why they're not being taught that, because it could actually instill some pride in the country. And God, we can't have that as part of the curriculum, can we? Now, even more alarming than that news is the latest school attendance figures from the Northern Territory. Indigenous children in the NT are attending school so infrequently that nearly 1,700 of them aren't even in official attendance figures. Let's hear from Sky News Northern Territory correspondent Matt Cunningham.
In 2024, according to this latest data, it's 55.7%. Now, if you compare that to non-Indigenous students here in the NT, there has been a drop-off in that area as well, but it's only dropped from an 89.3% attendance in 2016 to 85% in 2024. And as we were talking about last week, the real numbers are actually significantly worse. There are more than 1,700 students in the Northern Territory, more than 1,600 of those are Indigenous, who are taken off the official roll because they attend school so infrequently.
Patrick, there's so much focus on closing the gap, so much spending on closing the gap, but those figures tell a story, and it's a worrying story. We're not going to be closing the gap if attendance numbers are falling like that.
And it's a Northern Territory story too. If you actually look at the Indigenous attendance rates for every other state and territory, they're 30% higher than the Northern Territory. Look, these are complicated issues. All the closing the gap issues are very complicated. I've been to these remote communities. I mean, you can pick out one symptom, as this is, and say, hang on, this is bad. There's a much wider sort of set of problems that go to it. But this is out of kilter with the rest of Australia. It's a Northern Territory problem.
It is, and they've got a relatively new government. Let's see what they can do there. Meanwhile, in New South Wales, a mass exodus from state schools is underway as more parents opt to send their children to Catholic and private schools. Patrick, we're in a cost of living crisis, so this is significant news. People are going without, making huge sacrifices because obviously they see a problem with the state school system.
Yeah, look, people are choosing to pay, according to these figures, $5,000 a year that they wouldn't otherwise, or $40,000 a year to make sure their kids have a decent education. It shows a lack of faith in the education system, and perhaps it actually shows a pushback against some of the values that we see in public education, some of the wokeness that sort of crept in and really taken over in so many ways. A lot of people are saying no.
That's it. And at state schools, you really don't have the option to say no. At least at a private school, even if this wokeness is being shoved down your throat, you can take a stand because you're paying for it. Now, tourism and cruise ship bosses have warned the Jacinta Allen government in Victoria that its 15% increase to port fees and the lack of upgrades to the hopelessly old and tired station pier is going to cause a max exodus from Melbourne by cruise ship operators. This is huge money. Herald Sun reports that the state is expected to lose millions in revenue as it braces for a 70% plunge in the number of ships that will use the city as a home port next season. This is just, again, more Victorian government, short-sighted taxes to try to raise some money because the state's in debt, it's broke. But in the long run, it's going to cost us money because people come on those cruise ships, they spend a day in the city and they spend up.
Well, Melbourne doesn't have all the natural advantages of some of the other places that cruise ships stop. It has to have great infrastructure, and they haven't spent the money on Station Pier. They've jacked up the tax, as they've done on so many things in so many tricksy sort of ways in the last couple of years. It's just another symbol, and it's an important symbol. As you say, it's a lot of money. The Victorians are missing out on this money because of mismanagement of something that's pretty basic to begin with.
We've got Port Phillip Bay. We do have the natural assets, but we're not utilising it. Patrick Carlyon, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thanks, Rita.